late April 1945. Soviet soldiers are pushing through a forest north of Berlin when they come across a fence that shouldn't be there. Behind it, barracks, a crematorium still warm, and thousands of women barely clinging to life. These soldiers had already seen the worst the war could offer. Nothing prepared them for this. For 6 years, the Nazis ran a concentration camp built specifically for women. A place where doctors performed unconsented surgical experiments on healthy teenagers, where a gas chamber operated in near total secrecy until the final weeks of the war, and where somewhere between 30,000 and 90,000 women never walked back out. Today, we're uncovering the full story of Ravensbrück psyche. The camp history tried to bury. If stories like this matter to you, the ones that don't make it into the textbooks, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because WW2 Real History is dedicated to telling the parts of this war that get left out. Comment below and let me know if you'd heard of Ravensbrück before this video. Let's begin. 90 kilometers north of Berlin, near a quiet town called Fürstenberg, sits a flat stretch of forest beside a lake. In May 1939, months before the war even started, the SS chose this exact spot to build something the world had never seen at this scale. A concentration camp designed specifically to imprison women. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the entire Nazi camp system, personally selected the location and oversaw its construction. Male prisoners from nearby Sachsenhausen were forced to build it. The barracks, the walls, the administrative offices, essentially constructing the machine that would soon consume tens of thousands of lives. On May 18, 1939, the first prisoner 7 women, mostly German and Austrian, labeled as political dissidents, so-called criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and women the regime dismissed as asocial, a vague catch-all label used against prostitutes, homeless women, or simply anyone who didn't fit the Nazi ideal. The first commandant, Max Keugel, ran the camp until 1942. He was replaced by Fritz Suren, the man who would preside over Ravensbrück CK's most horrifying years, and who would later become one of the most hunted war criminals in post-war Europe. The guards weren't soldiers pulled from the front lines. They were ordinary German women, recruited and trained right there at the camp before being sent across the entire concentration camp system. One of them, a teenager named Dorothea Binz, arrived at just 19 years old. Within a few years, she'd become one of the most feared and sadistic figures in the camp's history. In its early years, Ravensbrück held a few thousand prisoners. That changed fast. As the German army swept across Europe, women from Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia were funneled into the camp by the thousands. By the early 1940s, a facility never designed to hold more than a few thousand people was bursting at the seams. And the deeper the numbers climbed, the worse the conditions became. But overcrowding wasn't the darkest chapter. What happened next crossed into territory that's almost impossible to process. Starting in the summer of 1942, SS doctors began using the women of Ravensbrück as test subjects. These weren't rogue actors. These were credentialed physicians, operating with full institutional backing, connected to a much larger network of human experimentation running across the entire Nazi camp system. 2 types of procedures defined this horror. The first involved wound infections. Germany's soldiers were dying on the battlefield not just from bullets, but from gas gangrene, a devastating bacterial infection. Rather than test treatments through legitimate medical research, doctors like Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's own personal physician, cut deliberate wounds into the legs of healthy women and infected them on purpose, simply to observe what happened. Some of these women died from the infections doctors inflicted on them. Others survived, but were left with permanent damage. Chronic infections, destroyed muscle tissue, and scarring that never fully healed. The second category was even more invasive. Doctors surgically removed bones and muscle tissue from prisoners, often without adequate anesthesia, testing theories about transplantation and nerve regeneration. Some of the women who endured this were as young as 16 years old. There was no real consent involved. Women were told they'd been volunteered, or given a choice between undergoing experimentation or facing execution, which was, in truth, no choice at all. Many of the Polish women subjected to these procedures became known after the war by a haunting nickname, the Ravensbrück rabbits, because they had been treated exactly like laboratory test animals. By 1943 and 1944, the camp had become a nightmare of overcrowding. Barracks built for 150 people were crammed with 400 or more. Prisoners slept in rotating shifts. Sanitation had collapsed entirely. Lice and disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis tearing through the population with nothing to stop it. Every single morning, prisoners were forced to stand outside for roll call, sometimes for hours, in brutal winter conditions beside the lake. For women already weakened by starvation, this alone was often a death sentence. And then came the labor. Ravensbrück doubled as a forced labor camp. Right next door, a Siemens factory. Yes, the same Siemens that still operates globally today. Used prisoner labor to manufacture electrical components for the German war machine. Women worked 10-hour shifts, unpaid on starvation rations, punished harshly for failing to meet production quotas. Others worked inside the camp itself, sewing uniforms, sorting confiscated clothing stripped from deportees, or laboring in nearby fields. Discipline was administered with casual brutality. A punishment bunker held women in dark isolation cells for days or weeks at a time. Public floggings were used as a warning to others. Dorothea Binns was known to personally carry out beatings, and by survivor accounts, she seemed to take pleasure in it. Guard dogs were used as weapons. Women were shot for attempting escape, or sometimes for reasons never recorded at all. And yet, even inside this machine of cruelty, resistance survived. Prisoners shared what little food they had. They hid the sick during selections. Polish prisoners organized secret networks and smuggled coded letters to the outside world. Some women risked their lives hiding scraps of paper, quietly documenting what was happening, hoping that someday, somehow, the truth would reach the outside world. By late 1944, the Soviet army was advancing rapidly from the east, and the Nazis began evacuating camps in Poland and the Baltic states, funneling thousands more prisoners into Ravensbrück. The camp's population swelled toward 50,000 women. The death rate climbed even faster. It was in this final, desperate stretch of the war that the camp crossed into a new level of horror. The Nazis built a gas chamber. It was small compared to the industrial-scale killing facilities at Auschwitz, Birkenau. But it was just as lethal. It began operating in late January or early February 1945. In only a few months, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 women were murdered inside it. SSS doctors conducted the selections themselves, examining prisoners and marking those judged too weak to keep working. These women were told they were being sent to a rest camp. Many suspected the truth. Survivor accounts describe desperate women pinching their own cheeks or applying makeup, trying to appear healthier during selection, anything to avoid being chosen. Others were simply too sick to fight back. As Soviet forces closed in from the east, Himmler, sensing Germany's defeat was inevitable, began secret negotiations with Swedish Red Cross official Count Folke Bernadotte, hoping to use prisoner releases as a bargaining chip for his own post-war treatment. Those negotiations led to one of the more remarkable rescue operations of the entire war, the White Buses. Starting in late March 1945, Swedish and Danish Red Cross convoys arrived at Ravensbrück to evacuate Scandinavian prisoners. The program eventually expanded to include French, Belgian, and Polish women as well. Between late March and mid-April, roughly 500 women were pulled out of the camp and driven to safety in Sweden and Denmark. For those women, it was the difference between life and death. But for the tens of thousands left behind, a different fate was waiting. On April 27 and 28, 1945, with Soviet troops just days away, the SS forced the remaining prisoners, somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 women, out of the camp and onto the roads, marching them westward with no real destination. Guards shot anyone who couldn't keep pace. Women collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure to the cold. Some managed to slip away into the forest during the chaos. Others were liberated within days by advancing Soviet or Allied troops. Commandant Fritz Suren fled the camp that same day, dragging a small group of prisoners with him as human bargaining chips, including Odette Sansom, a captured British intelligence agent. He eventually handed his hostages over to American forces, hoping it would buy him leniency. It didn't. Suren was later captured, tried, and executed in 1950. Behind him, he left a camp still full of the sick and the dying. On April 30th, 1945, the exact same day Adolf Hitler took his own life inside his Berlin bunker, Soviet troops of the 49th Army reached Ravensbrück's gates. What they found was a camp on the verge of total collapse. The SS had already fled. The gas chamber had only recently gone silent, hastily and partially dismantled in a rushed attempt to hide the evidence. Documents had been set on fire. Estimates suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 women remained inside the main camp, alongside others still scattered in the surrounding woods. Many were too weak to even stand. The Soviet soldiers gave what aid they could, sharing their own rations, though tragically, feeding severely malnourished bodies too quickly can trigger a fatal condition known as refeeding syndrome. It's believed this claimed lives even after liberation, a cruel final twist for women who had survived so much. The nearby town of Ravensbrück had lived within sight of the camp for years. Smoke from the crematorium had been visible from town streets. The smell had, at times, been unmistakable. Prisoners had been marched publicly through town on labor details. Claims by local residents that they had no idea what was happening just beyond the fence are, to put it plainly, very hard to believe. Soviet forces later forced some local Germans to walk through the camp and witness it firsthand, a practice American forces used at camps like Dachau and Buchenwald around the same time. In the weeks following liberation, investigators from multiple Allied nations arrived to document what had happened. The Nazis had tried to erase the evidence, but they hadn't succeeded completely. Some records survived because prisoners had hidden them. Others simply because Germany's collapse happened faster than the SS could destroy everything. Soviet investigators began photographing the barracks, the medical wards, the punishment bunker, and the remains of the gas chamber almost immediately, gathering survivor testimony while memories were still raw. British investigators arrived too, driven partly by the fact that several British Special Operations executive agents, undercover operatives sent to sabotage Nazi operations across occupied Europe, had been executed at Ravensbrück. Violet Szabo, Nora Inayat Khan, Lillian Rolfe, and Denise Bloch were among them, all killed at the camp in early 1945. Their cases became some of the most thoroughly documented individual stories connected to the camp, and helped fuel British determination to bring the perpetrators to justice. What emerged from the investigation was staggering. Over its 6 years of operation, Ravensbrück had imprisoned somewhere between 150,000 and 150,000 women and girls, pulled from more than 30 countries. Estimates of the death toll range from 30,000 to as high as 90,000. Between December 1946 and July 1948, a series of trials took place in Hamburg, Germany, prosecuting those responsible. They never received the global spotlight of the Nuremberg trials, but they were serious, consequential legal proceedings. In the first trial, 16 defendants stood accused. 11 were sentenced to death and hanged on May 2, 1947, at Hameln Prison. Later trials targeted the doctors behind the experiments. Karl Gabart was convicted separately at the Nuremberg doctors' trial and executed in 1948. Another physician, Fritz Fischer, received a life sentence, but was released in 1954 as part of a broader post-war amnesty, a decision that left many survivors furious. Countless guards and SS personnel were never caught at all. Many simply vanished, changed their names, and rebuilt their lives in the chaos of post-war Europe. For the women who walked out of Ravensbrück, liberation wasn't the end of their suffering. In many ways, it was just the beginning of a new, quieter struggle. Political divisions across post-war Europe complicated everything. Polish survivors connected to resistance movements sometimes struggled to gain recognition from their own post-war communist government. French survivors, by contrast, were often celebrated as national heroines, and organizations like the Amicale de Ravensbrück, CK, formed quickly to support them and preserve their stories. One of the most important voices to emerge was Germaine Tillion, a French anthropologist and resistance member who survived the camp and spent decades afterward researching and documenting its history. She lived to be 100 years old, and her work remains essential to understanding Ravensbrück today. For countless survivors, the physical toll never went away. Chronic illness, lasting disability from the experiments, immune systems permanently weakened by years of starvation, and the psychological wounds were largely left untreated in an era when trauma wasn't yet understood as a medical condition requiring real care. Compensation, when it came at all, arrived slowly and painfully. West Germany eventually created reparations programs, but survivors had to prove their imprisonment through bureaucratic systems that often felt re-traumatizing in their own right. And for many survivors, trapped behind the Iron Curtain, these programs were never accessible at all. Today, Ravensbrück stands as one of the most important memorial sites dedicated to the women who suffered under Nazi rule. A permanent reminder of what happened in that quiet forest north of Berlin, and a warning about how easily systems of cruelty can be built when no one is watching closely enough. This is a story that deserves to be remembered, not buried in archives or footnotes, but told clearly, honestly, and completely. If this video moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to WW2 Real History, and let me know in the comments which untold WI story you want covered next. There's so much more of this history still waiting to be told. See you in the next one.